Okay, so it's John Robb here interviewing Jenni Fagan, Scottish-based author with a fantastic series of books, culminating so far in the great Luckenbooth, which came out in January, I think, didn't it?
Yep. Yeah.
No, it's a wonderful book. It's very dark, multi-layered, drifts through different times, different floors of a house. It's on one level, it's a perfect Edinburgh Gothic novel. But it's lots of other levels. There's magic realism. There's just complete weird tangents, pop culture. It's everything's in there, but somehow it makes sense. It's got a linear narrative. It all hangs together. I mean, what was it for you? Was it just a big splurge of ideas you've been carrying around all your life?
Luckenbooth released it, or my love letter to Edinburgh. I have a love-hate relationship with this city. And I've been brought up in and around lots of the areas and places that you don't see on the tourist map. And so I was always intrigued by those stories. I've always more interested by those stories. Years and years ago, I was staying in downtown Cairo in this no stars pension, and I loved it. It was so kind of shambolic and decayed and what kind of stunning at the same time. You know, I had all this great art deco architecture, and I was staying in this no stars pension run by this old Italian lady who had like big bunions on her feet, and she didn't speak any English and I don't speak any Italian, but we just totally understood each other. She had this big cat, this big matted long hair cat, that in the kind of Egyptian heat, I was like, that cat's gonna die. And that cat, I'm amazed that cat's alive. And then in my room, there was a heart drawn in the dirt on the wall, and there was just dust on everything. And whilst I was there, I was kind of traveling about, and I was reading the Yakubian Building by Ala Al-Sani, which is a great book. And it was telling all the stories that you don't see. It was talking about the gay clubs. It was talking about the homeless communities living up on the rooftops in Cairo. And it just enhanced my time in Egypt so much more to be able to get a hold of those stories that weren't the sanctioned stories. And I've lived in or around Edinburgh since I was a little girl, other than I did a chunk of time in London. But other than that, I've always been here. So I've always been kind of collecting stories and characters and people anyway. And about 20 odd years ago, I moved into my first flat. I'd been living in a bedsit for a couple of years. I was in homeless accommodation. I moved out into the smallest flat in Edinburgh, literally the smallest flat in Edinburgh. It was tiny. And it was like living in a tall cupboard. And it was in a really creepy old tenement building. And one day I found out that the attic was covered in grass, grown up really high, and that somebody had been squatting up there. And eventually they took the middle of the building out, and they couldn't get anybody to come in because the basement was so covered in needles that none of the cleaning companies would come in and touch it. But when I was walking over those kind of worn steps, I used to think I'm walking past hundreds of years of the dead and the living. You know, Edinburgh's a city where the dead and the living feel very close to each other in a way. And what are all those secrets? You know, we know what our neighbours sound like when they're having a fight with their partner. We know what time they make a cup of tea. We know what time they flush their loo. We know lots of different things without knowing the people. But then what are all those other stories that we don't know as well? And what are the secrets that we leave in buildings? And so I knew one day I would build a kind of tenement building of my own and place a world in there.
Yeah, it lends itself very well to Edinburgh because architecturally, Edinburgh is the city that's on levels, isn't it? Like the old city, the 4 or 5 story tenements, and then you've got the new town, which is lower down. You can actually see the history, the stratas of history there in front of you. So in a sense, the characters in the house, of course, they're conduits to the story, but the house itself is almost a character and the city.
Absolutely. You know, and I lived in a caravan for quite a long time when I was little, and I used to come in on the bus and you'd look up at the big tenements and they seemed really fancy to me. You know, you'd look and think, wow, look at that. And I was always fascinated by them. And originally we had tenements that were up to like 15 stories high, made of wood, and then they didn't survive. And I think the tallest ones we've got now are maybe 9 or 10 floors, and they're just these big buildings. And you know, I was thinking a lot about structures. I was thinking a lot about the structures that we all live within. watching the different things going on. Trump had just been elected in America. Various different celebrations of very narcissistic, sociopathic, powerful people in the world. And just kind of witnessing a dividing ideology that I hadn't quite seen in the same way. I grew up in the 90s and things were different. They weren't certainly weren't perfect, but they were different. Would come out the 80s, would come out the recession, got rid of Thatcher. And there was a real feeling of hope in the 90s. There's a lot of interesting things in drug culture, a lot of interesting things in music. And I was just aware that something felt really bad about the world to me. And I wanted to look at those structures in this structure that these individuals live within. That the structures are not very aware of the individuals, but the individuals are massively impacted on by the structures.
So the individuals themselves are reflections of those kind of sociopathic kind of people.
Well, they're either at the mercy of them or they're completely non-existent to them. So the book goes up over 100 years, and on the last decade, it's just before in the bells in the year 2000, and my character Dot's squatting in the building. She's a cosmic agent. She's on the dole. She's been squatting there for quite a while. The building's totally taken apart by that point, and she's somebody that would be completely unseen by the structures, but she's absolutely the center of how the entire book comes together at that point.
Is it, with your background, because when you grew up, you were moving constantly and you had no settled, solid background yourself, is there a fascination with the solidity of a building?
Really, yeah. There's definitely an ongoing thing with me in buildings. And I grew up in the care system in Scotland. So I was always an outsider. I was always moving to different areas. And I thought the first thing I would always see would be the building of wherever I was going to live. And then somebody'd knock at a door, somebody'd open the door, and you'd go in and live there for a while, So yeah, the way that buildings house people, but also I was growing up within a wider structure. I was growing up, I was raised by the state, literally. And a lot of that's policy, policy raises people, policy warehouses people, policy impacts on people. And so it's, the structures themselves are an obsession that's never really going to go away for me in one way or another. It was actually nice when I got older and I started looking out at the wider structures and thinking, we're all institutionalized. Just some of us are more obviously raised in those extremes than others, but it's everywhere. And that really connected me to that theme in a different way.
And with that kind of background and always being with different people and moving to different places, for somebody who's a writer, does that give you plenty of scope for characters and the fluidity of life as well?
I think that I had to observe people very carefully from a very young age, and people that I wasn't related to. It was a very, very strange way to be raised, a very extreme way to be raised. And I saw, all the most extreme parts of life. And I think whilst that on a personal level is not a great thing, it meant that I was observing humans in a very acute way from day dot. And, Patti Smith I think it was Patti Smith said, being in the periphery is a great place for an artist to be. Somebody said that. And I think it does give you a clear viewpoint, eventually, if you can survive it, basically. So those things are all inextricably tied. So
in a sense, on the outside looking in, would that be true?
Yeah, very much so. If you don't, I've met very few people that don't know anybody they're related to by blood, and that was my upbringing. I have a son now, so obviously I know my son. But it's a very, very odd thing to know almost nothing about your origins, and people take it for granted that, I laugh like that because Uncle so and so does, and there's so many different nuances to what families do, that when you're somebody who is raised out with that and observing that to a certain degree, you just view it in a different way. And most of the characters in my books tend to be either individuals or people in non-conventional family setups, because that makes a lot more sense to me.
In a sense, Luckenbooth, is it a collection of individuals, or is there a sense of a strange, odd family there?
I get what you mean. I mean, the Devil's Daughter arrives in 1910. She rose to Edinburgh in her coffin that her father, the devil, built for her. She's left him dead, rammed in a crevice up in the islands, and she marches up Leith Walk, takes a job for the Minister of Culture, very, very wealthy, very well-respected man, expected to have statues, all over the city, etc. Wealthy philanthropist, very cultured. He's just come back from Paris, where he's been hanging out in Gertrude Stein's salon, amongst other places. And he has this amazing library, and he's smoking opium, and they're drinking absinthe. And she takes a job working for him and his fiancé, and she's to carry a child for them. She ends up living in a menage with Mr. Utnam and Elise. And an event happens which is very brutal, and the Devil's Daughter curses the building for 100 years, and the curse travels through every decade, and every character's life is impacted directly or indirectly by Jessie and her curse. So there is a commonality in certain ways between them. There is a vein between them, and they're all tapping into this sickness in the building. Burroughs moves in the 1960s. He's in the building for a little while. He'd been over in Edinburgh for the 1962 Writers' Conference, which was a really big conference, and a lot of writers who hadn't met each other were there. And you had Alexander Trocchi, you had Hugh McDermott, you had Burroughs. Apparently they asked Trocchi what his inspiration for literature was, and he said sodomy, and Hugh McDermott nearly spat his teeth out, and all these different things happened. There was big fights amongst the writers. Anyway, Burroughs has come back to Edinburgh because he's fascinated by the city, likes the oldness of it. He can get really good quality heroin, and he's living up in this 1960s floor with his boyfriend doing cut-ups, and he's very, very high, and he starts and he puts a little glass to the floor, and he said this building is a psychic vampire. It's taken the souls of the residents, but he can hear the decades before, and there's that echo that passes on and back, and I really enjoyed that. It was a big structure to weave together, to pull all those stories together and to have them kind of lock into each other. And there's things like in the 1950s, there's a seance held by a medium called Agnes and her husband. Archie's like this old kind of rockabilly guy, and he's drinking his tenants, and he's putting up with these seances, but he's really pissed off that his wife keeps coming home with ectoplasm. And it was at the end of the UK witchcraft laws. They were just being abolished at the time, and they changed them to the Fraudulent Medium Act. So anyway, this seance is going on. And one of the things about Agnes is she just thinks her husband doesn't really, she knows he loves her, but she doesn't think he really loves her. And she doesn't think he gets her at all. So she has this kind of sadness about this, but they're together, and that's that. And then you find out a decade later, via the Burroughs decade, that what you thought had happened wasn't what happened. And Archie completely loved and cared for his wife and was completely dedicated to her. And at that point, she couldn't see it. And this happens all the way through the building. Stories tell and untell and retell themselves over those decades. And that was an enjoyable thing to finally pull together.
I mean, how much research goes into making a book like this with a William Burroughs story? Does it have to be historically not completely correct, but sort of half correct? He was in Edinburgh at this time, therefore it works in the book. And it
to be, it doesn't have to be anything, because, in a novel you can do anything you want to do. It's the reason I always go back to novels. It's the one form where I am not tied by anything other than my own imagination. However, I wanted to ground it in reality as much as possible. And so a huge amount of research went into it. I would draw the building out on my bedroom from floor to ceiling, and you would have each decade, each flat, each character, what their job was, what was going on in culture, what was going on in politics, any big historical events that were going on around the world at the time, how their stories interweaved with each other, how the curse was passing through. And even if it wasn't directly in there, you needed to know, okay, that was the tail end of World War II, or that was just after the Spanish flu pandemic, or, all these various different things. So it was an act of madness, really, to write this book at all. And people would ask me about it when I was writing it for, I was writing it for a long time, and other writers would come and ask me about it, or they'd see it on the wall and they'd just be a bit confused, they'd be like, you're doing what? You're writing a book over 100 years, the Devil's Door, and you've got 9 different protagonists, what are you doing? And for much of the time I thought, what am I doing as well? But I don't really see the point in doing something unless you're pushing boundaries and trying to do something that you're not sure you can achieve. I think that's kind of the point to art, is do it in a state of fear, or do it in a state of unknowing, and just keep going back into that space and keep turning up and don't stop until you get there. Yeah.
So how much does being Scottish inform it? I mean, obviously Edinburgh is a backdrop, but is there a sense of Scottishness to the way you write, or the writer like write, or do you write very much in isolation, or is it not matter at all?
Yeah, I think there's definitely there'll definitely be quite a strong Scottish identity in it in some ways, but I'm massively influenced by writers all over the world, and artists all over the world, and musicians all over the world, and I always was. I grew up thinking Scotland was the least exotic, most shit country on earth, as many of us in poor backgrounds in pretty rough areas did. But there are things that are intrinsically Scottish about it as well, But I think that every novel's like a microcosm of the macrocosm, so a little reflection of whatever is going on out there. And I love the way that those things travel. My first book is about a female young offender growing up in a panopticon in the care system, and there's a version of that in Korea, there's a version of that in Italian, there's in these different countries, and you go there and there's people and they're like, they have their version of this, they have their take on this, they have their connection to this, and I like that. I don't like to be too American. There's some great writers in this country, but I'm not too immersed in the world of literature, because it's just a pain in the ass a lot of the time, basically.
Yeah, like stories that they defy time, defy space, defy geography. A story's a story.
Exactly. And there's no saying, my next fiction novel it's not really set anywhere in a way. Murakami wrote a book set in Camden. He'd never set foot in Camden. He makes a great book set in Camden. I'd love to go back to Egypt and spend 6 months writing in Cairo. I'd like to spend time living in Paris. I'd like to spend time living in New York. These things all become more acute when you're in lockdown and can't even visit, So I go where the story's meant to be. And these first 3 stories were meant to be here, but it doesn't mean that they all will be.
So you're quite a multidisciplinary artist. You're doing sculpture, you've done music. I mean, why did you settle on literature? Was that just the one you felt that was the best way of expressing yourself, or is it just the one you're actually doing at the moment and it moves around?
I always felt you could only be really, really great at one thing. Like, you could enjoy doing a lot of things and you could get to a certain level in a lot of things. But if you really, really wanted to be as good as you could be at something, you needed to pretty much dedicate your life to it and spend most days doing it one way or another. And I still love music, and I still miss music, and I still sing a lot. But there was a point where I just thought it would ruin me. I didn't think I would cope well with it long term as a lifestyle. I think you've got to be resilient in a way that's different to the resilience that I had at the time. I kind of retired from music when I was 23, and words has always been the first one. I started with poetry when I was 7, and when I didn't want to deal with life, or I couldn't deal with people, words were always there. So words were one thing that could remain constant no matter how unable I was to function at different times, or unable to kind of be part of that social thing. Words were always there. And I was a writer. I was always a writer. I was always a poet. I was always a writer. And I actively made the choice to dedicate myself mostly to one thing. And I still love making art. Like, I was engraving poetry onto bones for a year. And I really enjoyed that. And I got some really great sculptures out of that. And I've done other I built a big Scold's Bridle from steel and engraved it with words sent to me by women in prison in the UK and US. And it was a kind of sort of collaborative project. And I love doing that. So I love the physicality, you know, writing's all in your head. I love the physicality of being able to work in the other art forms and stuff. But since I was really wee, it was either going to be music or it was going to be writing full time. It was only going to be one or the other. And so, yeah.
But it's very much about words, the power of words. So, I mean, what's the fascination words? Is it the sound of them, the energy of them, the multi-layer meanings of them?
Yeah, I mean, words are how we have built every single thing in our society. It's how we build our drawers that we get from IKEA. It's how we legislate. It's how we bury people. It's how we marry them. It's how we imprison them. It's how we structure our societies. You know, words are the foundation of everything in a way. And when I was little, I didn't speak for periods of time. So I was kind of voiceless in the care system, but I was also literally voiceless at times. And when I wrote my first poem, I was about 7, no reason at all to do it. I actually wrote a poetry collection, really no reason to do that. And being able to see my voice and go back and pick it up again when there was no other constant anywhere, and when I struggled to just even speak, or sometimes just, you know, wouldn't speak at all, it was incredibly compelling. And then I started reading books, and books allowed me to survive my life. You know, I wouldn't have been able to get through it without that escape, you know, especially when I was a lot younger, and you can't just go out and get trashed or whatever it is you're doing to cope when you're older, you know. So I thought there's just a huge power in this. And I was always told a story about who I was in the care system. And, you know, I wasn't really convinced by the way in which a lot of people tell stories. You know, I was always intrigued by that. And I was always intrigued by storytellers as well. So I think words there's something a lot of people are told they're meant to stay out of. It's not your business. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's not your area. It's not your forte. And I think more of those people should go in and make it their business.
I mean, so in a sense, you felt like even your own life felt like a fiction or a semi-fiction.
Well, to me, no, it was like 100% as real could be. But the way in which it was contextualized in the system, the way in which you're written about all the time, like I have social work files like this, where, you know, strangers kind of put down a version of, you know, what they think in that 2 weeks that they work with you, or 6 months that they work with you, and it's very, very, very impacted by policy and all these other things. So, you know, who a person is and what a person is told they are, you know, like people think a certain thing about you on meeting you is often nothing to do with who you are, you know, and that can be a long road to work that out. But it was something that always intrigued me.
So with music, was it like an accentuation of the power of the words because it's got the music as well and the melody?
Absolutely. I joined a punk band when I was 15. I was living in a kids' home, and I've been getting in a lot of trouble. And I was born in 77, so, you know, punk was not, you know, I thought it was a bit, you know, I was into kind of other stuff when I was younger. I was into loads of 60s and 70s music, actually, lots of Detroit and kind of Motown and girl groups and stuff like that. But I was working in ground control in Edinburgh in Colburn Street, in this little shop that did piercings and sold tie-dye stuff. And used to be able to smoke then when you worked. You'd watch MTV and smoke and doodle. And there was a little advert in the window for a singer, and I'd always sang. I'd always written songs, and I'd always sang. And anyway, went down and met these 2 guys, and they were rehearsing in an old down at the docks, and this kind of like old hut at the docks had like an upside down cross spray painted on the wall, and there was a punk lived up in the attic. He literally lived up there, and anyway, tried out, and I found that the anger I had was able to completely channel, and I could kind of expel that, and I could have this connection with these other people without actually having to talk to them either. Just that kind of psychic connection that you get when you play well with people. And then I could go on stage, and all that rage, all of those thoughts, all those different things, at the end of it, you know, people clapped, and it wasn't that you were in a massive amount of trouble for other ways that you might have expressed the same energy. And that was a complete revelation to me. And I'd watched a film at the time set in India about a woman who'd been through a rape, and she decided to take revenge on the perpetrators. And she talked about the goddess Shiva being the goddess of creation, but also the goddess of destruction. And I remember thinking at the time, if I can flip that energy, that self-destructive, mile-wide energy, then you have the ability to do this thing. And then the other really cool part of it was I was given tape cassette, which I'd listened to in the kids' home over and over, that had like polystyrene and, Teenage Jesus and the Jerks and Jenni Fagan and all kinds of different female singers that really had something to say. And, India had been kind of king for quite a while in the early 90s, and there wasn't loads and loads of great female-led stuff going on. There was some, but there wasn't, it was more in like pop or more in other areas. So yeah, it was kind of really gave me something to belong to. And also I'd always been, I didn't tell people. A lot of people knew a lot about me, just because you're moving about a lot and because of your life, people have these kind of ideas or whatever. And it was the first time that I was able to kind of, they were like, where'd you live? And I was like, well, I live in a kid's home. And I didn't want to tell them because I was like, well, they might not want to play with me. Do you know what I mean? And then they thought that was cool. And then they were like, asked other things about my life and about growing up in the caravan park for a while and stuff. And they were like, Iggy Pop grew up in a caravan for a chunk of time. And suddenly I was aware that a lot of the things that had been negatives in this world weren't necessarily negatives. And I was able to kind of educate myself via music and via the musicians that, if a musician mentioned an artist they were into, I'd go and check them out. Or if they mentioned a writer that they liked, I would go and check them out. And so it really was a kind of education. And I'd left school at 15, no qualifications whatsoever. I didn't go much after the age of 12. So it was just this really kind of vital thing, to tap into that culturally and tap into the world via, tap into the New York no wave scene, tap into all these different things going on out there. And then grunge came along about that point as well. And it was just kind of like, just an energy that I loved, So yeah, very grateful for the process of that.
So it kind of created both an extended family in a sense and also a college of culture.
Yeah, I met a lot of people, that I wouldn't have met otherwise. And, in the care system, most of the ways that a lot of kids are dealing with them are legit prison. They're not good ways of dealing with things. And I think a lot of people find themselves in music because they need somewhere to be, that they'll be accepted and that they can do something that's creative and that's cool and that's interesting and that other people can take. There's joy in it. There's moments of pure joy in that. And I like just being in a, little dingy rehearsal room for 6-7 hours at a time, talking crap and playing songs over and over and over, yeah, absolutely.
So what did you actually play then?
Sing.
Did you play an instrument or?
I play guitar, not great. I'm not a great guitarist, but I do play guitar. I got a guitar actually. A friend of mine, Colin Cooper, played in a band called Mr. Ray's Wig World in Liverpool. He gave me his Shergold 1977 handmade Shergold masquerader, and I was about 17. And I used to have loads of guitar. I enjoy guitar. I like guitars if they're kind of, I like to play with a distortion and a big muff and a bunch of things and get that really gnarly sound. And I enjoy playing the drums. I used to have I had a drum kit set up in my living room for years, and I'm more kind of Mo Tucker, fairly simple. I tried to do a paradiddle for years. Well, I only got so far with it, but I can batter the drums quite happy. Do you know what I mean? But singing was my thing, and I do still sing. I think I'd like to do something that was really lo-fi, maybe just like murder ballads with 2 other people, but only gig twice a year, like once in Russia and once in, Paris and some wee dive bar. And that would be enough, that would totally be enough. for me. And lots of those, the songs and singers that, I listened to over and over as well kind of brought me up. I remember listening to Nina Simone over and over and over and over again for years. And again, then being tied into, well, what was she into? Who did she listen to? What was going on in there? And, it's like a map of the world. Music's a whole tree and map of the world that you can tap into.
Interesting, Edinburgh with its music, because Glasgow's got such a massive, dominant music scene, internationally known. And Edinburgh's very much in its shadow, but also always had a very great, intense underground music scene that a lot of people don't really know about, which in a way kind of sums up the weird dichotomy of Edinburgh. And it's known, like I was saying in the beginning of this interview, it's known for a lot of things. There's actually a lot of other things going on there that people don't expect, isn't there?
Completely. And it's a really, it's a city of extremes. It's, great wealth, great poverty, great darkness, great light, great beauty, great ugliness, great violence. There's a lot of different things pulsing. And, Edinburgh was built over another city, literally built over another city. There's catacombs under the whole place. There's a lot of pressure because the council would shut down a lot of the good little venues in Edinburgh, so people would go through and play in Glasgow more. So it was a slightly divided scene in that. But yeah, there was always great stuff going on. But it's a funny place. Edinburgh it's a strange city.
So for the music, was writing. You're already writing, doing your poetry. So to write literature, was that an extension out of the music, or was that a very, very different process and very different set of inspirations?
I find it similar. I basically think everything's a poem. Everything I see is as a poet. All the great lyricists are poets. Even in that Kurt Cobain said some of the great lyrics are just like nursery rhymes. But they're poetry. They're totally poetry. And so everything for me in a way is a bigger poem. Like a novel is just a much bigger poem that takes maybe 5 years rather than 5 minutes. And I have a theory about writers, which is we're often either musicians or artists, and it impacts on the way we write. And so when I'm writing, I write in the way that I would play, like you just for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, and then you make a huge mess. Then you go back and you try and make something out of that huge mess, but it has the same feeling to me. And there's a point where you can get the note completely right. You can get the line completely right. And you might have had to play for a long time to get there. But once you get there, you've got it, and it's immortalized, it's down, and you never have to touch it again. And so I'm a big believer in writers, making it a way of life and having that kind of commitment to practicing it. And sometimes I'll look at other writers' work and I'll meet them and I'll be like, is it art or is it music? You might love both, but there'll be a stronger pull quite often to one. And it's fascinating. It does kind of leak into the way that we put worlds together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's so the discipline in the writing, you actually learned that from punk rock in a way.
Absolutely. And there's a conciseness to punk rock, like, does a song need to be longer than 3 minutes? Probably not. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Does a lyric have to be more complicated? Not necessarily. Can it be political and still sound great? Yeah, totally can be. And what is the energy? What's the energy behind it? And is it authentic? Like, is this a true thing? If it's not a true thing, people can hear it. Is it just for performance? Is it all style and no content? Because that's, it could be entertaining, but it's not going to have any lasting impact. Can you get somebody in the heart and fuck them up in that moment and make them feel connected to you? Can you do that? If you can do that, you've got something. Do you know what I mean? You've really got something. And absolutely, those things taught me a lot. They really did teach me a lot. And in books, they just happen in our heads, and I give it to somebody else and it happens in their head, and we meet each other and we've been in the same world. And you say, oh, did you notice that bit? Or, and then with music, it's not, you're there, you're in a room and you're able to kind of, that whole thing, and that instant fix of you plug in, you turn up and bang, you can hear it. you know. Novels are not like that. But if you get to the point eventually, you know, I do think they're like an A side or a B side. I do think they're, you know, most musicians are telling the same story throughout all of their work in one way or another. You know, they'll revisit certain things and characters and themes and things they're obsessed by. And writers do that, absolutely, you know.
So the real skill is to create an emotional content in an imaginary kind of character, so they feel real and fleshed out, and the reader has an emotional connection with the whether good or bad.
Mm-hmm. And when you're writing as well, my style is, you know, you go as far and hard as you have to meet the world, you know, like whatever that takes, you do it. You keep turning up until you can do it. When I was writing Luckenbooth, I was living in lots of derelict houses, renovating them and literally knocking down walls and taking these places apart and then, you know, flipping them, you know, settling them and trying to, you know, live whilst writing. And there's that thing of really pushing yourself beyond what's went before, you know. In music, like you inherit stuff, but you want to push at it, you want to push back at it, and you want to do something that's original. And you know, I think that willingness to let your fingers bleed, if it's going to produce the right song, you know, is the attitude actually people need to take at a certain level to make really good art or music or books.
Yeah, the art's there, and whatever the journey is to get to the art has to be undertaken, no matter how difficult it is.
Exactly. And we're living our lives through that time. You know, we're having our losses, we're having our gains, we're having our things that we can't cope with, or the things that we aspire to. And I think I always say there's a part of the cleverest part of my brain is the part that's writing the books. And the rest of our lives, we're not, but we are when we're doing that. But we're constantly gathering, like a little magpie. I'm constantly stashing images or, you know, the quality of light or something else, and it's going to keep going back in to that work.
In a sense, the writing side, the literature side, is the part of your life you have some kind of control on, or do you have no control on it at all? The imagination actually just lets you go all over the place.
I choose to write in a way that's really about lack of control. That's really about allowing that subconscious to be the boss and trusting it, and then having that horrible feeling of what the hell am I doing? Do you know what I mean? You know, telling my agent or telling somebody, and they're just like, okay. I'm like, okay. But there's something in there, you know. My second novel, all I knew was I wanted to write about light. And I wanted to write about light, and then I wanted to write about winter. And then I knew that I was writing about grief. And you're like, okay, I'm going to give 3 years of my life to this. And hopefully at the end, I'm going to put a full stop there and think, yeah, I got there. But you don't know, you never know you will. I never know I will. I never know that I'll get there, ever. So it's really writing into the unknown with no guide, no kind of, no formula, no nothing. Just you're in pursuit of something. And yeah.
So all great art, in a sense, is channeling the subconscious and not listening to the conscious mind.
I think is a big part of it. You know, I think we're told, you know, be polite, have manners, do this thing, da 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 da. None of us would get up and do anything if we just went with that. You have to go to the other level. And, you know, there's that collective unconscious where we're all gathering things about the world. You know, when Brexit was first happening, lots of writers in Europe started writing about cousins. They didn't really know when they were writing about cousins, but they were writing about cousins because we were about to live through another time of division. These things are intriguing, you know. All the writers and artists and musicians are all connected in some kind of a way. You know, we're all responding to the same world. And the part that's, you know, while we're walking down in the rain just trying to get home in 5 minutes, there's a part of our brain that, especially once you've practiced it, is constantly picking up this other thing that it's going to use when you finally sit down and say, okay, right, now it's time, you know. And I like, in the rest of my life, I like watching absolute trash telly and just like visual Valium and just letting my brain switch off, because I'm always pushing it harder than it hurts. Do you know what I mean? Like, I could have just taken up knitting or something. Like, what was I thinking? I don't know.
So it kind of, would you agree with someone like Nick Cave, who says that there actually is no moral code to writing or to art? It is what it is. You can't write a book full of right-on characters, because your conscious mind knows, really, in an ideal world, that'd be great, but your subconscious mind's actually got its own agenda, and you have to go with that agenda.
Yeah, and if you're writing about the human condition, you've got to write about the human condition, and that's, we're constantly sort of sanctioning ourselves and being, told to not have honest conversations. Don't be honest with your boss. Don't be honest with your partner. Don't be honest with the guy down at the corner shop. Don't be honest with the people you meet. And actually, I think art and literature is where we're having an honest conversation, and that can be terrifying. That can be ugly. It can be strange. It can be unsettling. But realistically, what's the point if we're not doing that? I could work in an office for 50 years and have to be dishonest about how much I like being there. If I'm going to choose to dedicate my life to the page, that's what I'm going to bring to it.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of which, I mean, you're obviously probably working on another project now, which you can't say. I mean, you shouldn't say what it is anyway. But so, are you working on a book, or you've got other different art projects? Are you doing poetry, or novel, your sculpture, or everything at the same time?
I'm always doing a few things. So I kind of can't do literary monogamy. I get really bored if I was just doing one thing, and novels take a long time. So, I do a lot of other stuff at the same time. So I've just finished a draft of my memoir, Years 0 to 16, called Utland. So I'll be doing another draft of that. I've got a poetry collection coming out next year called The Bone Library, about the year I spent working in the Bone Library with bones at Summerhall and engraving them and stuff. I'm working on a little independent original television series, very quietly, working with a company on that. And then I've got the first 30,000 words down for the next fiction novel. And I'm trying not to write it this year. I'm trying to take a full year off from writing a big novel, because the last one was big, and the memoir's really challenging, but in a different way. And I've got a book coming out about a witch called Gilly Duncan, who was tried in the North Berwick witch trials, called Hex. So it's based on the kind of factual events that occurred and led to the North Berwick witch trials at the time. So I'm studying lots of occult stuff again. And yeah, that'll come out next spring. So next year it'll be the Bone Library poetry collection, Hex, which is a kind of novella based on the witch trials, and deciding whether or not to put Utland out.
So that kind of occult side, is that something, again, is that a very Scottish sort of take on occult and those kind of stories, or is that just, it could be anywhere?
I think it could be anywhere. I mean, that's the Hex story in particular is based during the Scottish witch trials. So King James was coming to North Berwick from Denmark with his new wife Anne, and there was a big storm. He couldn't get in. He'd just written demonology, which is kind of the Bible for trying witches. So he was looking to try some witches, and he said the storm was obviously caused by witches going out in cauldron on the Firth of Forth and partying with the devil. And it was a big period in the history, of European witch trials, which, I've always been really interested by the occult since I was very small. And I've studied all the religions on and off at different times, and then usually would find them, a question in the stories. It's not always that handy, if you're looking at religions. But yeah, no, it's one that I would turn to a lot. I was asked when I was about 6 in primary school what I wanted to be when I was older, and I said a witch. And the teacher was Protestant. It's just like, yeah, that's really not Christian and not good. But I was always fascinated.
Again, was it the storytelling and the language that were part of that fascination? I
think so. And there was just a call to it. Like I was, strange kid in some ways. Like I would sometimes, you know, draw things that would happen later on, or, you know, I always had a very strong relationship with that energy, and I didn't really understand it. But, you know, those stories and the occult and the idea of witches seemed to just made a lot of sense to me. Yeah, I don't really talk about it that much, but I take that energy to my work. I take that energy to my writing. That's the place I try and spend most of it.
So a psychic energy is a good driving force for creativity and imagination.
I think, yeah, tapping into that. You know, people say like a magic can't exist. And it's like, well, we live in a world and we don't know why we're here, surrounded by a universe that we know very little about. We're all made out of the carbon of, you know, stars, the carbon and atoms of stars. So what do you really know about what exists in magic or doesn't exist, you know? And that idea of limitations on reality, limitations on the imagination, you know, I'm not into that. And that's why I keep going back to novels, because I'm trying to sort of remove those limitations and see what happens, you know, just when you put yourself in that space, see what comes from it. But definitely that instinctual way of walking down an alley and choosing just to turn left and realizing there's two people behind you and you don't know why you've done it. You know, those things that the brain does that we can't explain, I love. I think they're extraordinary. And I think they're a key to just, you know, us leveling up as a species, basically, hopefully at some point.
Trusting the subconscious and having a sensitivity to the environment and everything that's going on around, even the things that most people probably miss, is what makes great writing and imagination, in a sense. Exactly.
And it's a way of looking, it's a way of being, you know. There's a ode on melancholy, there's a stanza in ode on melancholy that says, "Glut thy sorrow in a morning rose." And I remember reading it when I was really, really depressed in my kind of late teens. And I was having lots of panic attacks, and I thought, what does this mean? And I thought, what it means is, even in the absolute pit of despair, look for beauty. And that beauty will be all the more beautiful. You'll still feel the melancholy. You'll still feel the intensity of that melancholy. But you've went out and you've looked for beauty. And that's what I trained my eye to do. But I also trained my eye to not look away when something was really horrific. And that's the dual thing that you then hopefully try and bring to the work.
Embrace everything.
That's it. Absolutely. For better or worse. It's, yeah. Marry yourself to the words and just, you know, do it till you die.
Brilliant. Well, that's good. That's a good point to end. Yeah. Well, thanks for that. That was fucking great. Yeah. Really interesting.
Yeah. Thank you for having me along.
Did our paths ever cross back in the music days? Because it's funny you mentioned Colin, because I've known Colin since he was about 17 or something.
Yeah. I spoke to him. He lives in Spain now, and I spoke to him the other day and he was like, "Oh, no, it's this." I said hello. He said he used to hang out with the mentors or around and go to the gigs and stuff. Yeah, no, he's good. He's good. I don't know if our paths, they might have at some point. I was the punk bands that were playing. They used to play like at the Hunt Sab and stuff in Edinburgh. You'd have like 5 bands on at the Cash Rock Cafe or wherever.
Yeah, I know the Cash Rock. Yeah, played there a few times.
Yeah, so you'd play you play with people like, there was Exploited and stuff. I'm sure we were asked to go and tour with them at one point, but our bass player didn't agree with their ideals on certain things or whatever. But then there was, who else was there? I'm trying to remember. So there was Splodginess of Bounds, there was the Gin Goblins, there was
yeah, I remember them.
All those kind of guys were up, but I was like 15, you know, I was way younger than all of them. They used to kind of be like, I'd be outside smoking, they'd be like, "You're not meant to be in school." I looked about 12.
yeah.
I was like,
what about the Cataran? Did you know them?
Cameron Fraser was my housing officer when I was in homeless accommodation.
Oh, really? Because they were like Edinburgh's grunge band, weren't they?
Yeah, I'm still friends with Cameron. Yeah, he was my housing officer when I was in homeless accommodation for 2.5 years. And he used to just come and talk to me about cricket and music, really. Yeah, no, Cameron's he's playing again. He's been playing again for a few years, actually. He's really enjoying it. He's really enjoying it. He's got an animation company now, and he does his job is kind of animation and script writing. But he's loved coming back to music a bit older. He was just like, it's just all the kind of joy and none of the bullshit, basically. We probably would have. We would have, definitely.
Yeah, or be in the same rooms at gigs or something at some point. So do you know
Liverpool a lot? I used to come down to Liverpool a lot and hang out with Colin. And go to the clubs and stuff in Liverpool.
Yeah, I know a lot of those people that he'd be hanging out with then, and the bands and that. So do you know Vic Galloway at all then?
I know Vic, yeah, Vic's lovely. So Vic's really good pals with a guy called Reg, and Reg was our tour manager when we were touring. So
I know him. Yeah,
Reg is lovely. He's in Australia now, and he's an absolute sweetheart. So yeah, I knew Vic through Reg because Reg and Vic shared a flat, and they were really good pals. And Vic's lovely. He's every once in a few years something pops up and say he. Yeah.
He always stays with me when he's down in Manchester doing the radio.
Oh, fab. Yeah.
They don't pay for a hotel for him, so he has to sleep on my couch. You're thinking, God.
Keeping it old school.
Do you know there's a punk guy in Edinburgh? He's like really old guy. He's about 70. He must be about 70 now.
Yeah.
He doesn't look 70. He looks about 50s or whatever.
Yeah.
I see him every couple of years, and I think, God, he's still out there doing it. He must have been a punk before punk. He's got like a mohawk, and it's amazing he's got a mohawk in his 70s.
Oh, I do think I know the guy you mean. There was
tall, skinny guy. You know his face. Yeah. You've seen him everywhere. Kind of character.
There was Calvin that ran. He ran the rehearsal rooms up until Cross, and then there was Big John, the bass player. He was always really lovely to me. He played with I think he played with Sad Society at one point, but he played with lots of other people as well. He was really nice. And then the bass player in my first band was a guy called Angry Al, and he'd had lots of different bands in Edinburgh over the years. And he must have been maybe in his 40s at least when I joined the band. I was 15. He'd been doing it like a long time. Al's still around. I think he had some really bad illness or something. But I got kicked out of actually all of my bands. Usually because the guys wanted to write the lyrics. I was usually in bands where the guys were a bit older and they wanted to write the lyrics, and I would just get bored after a while and be like, I don't want to sing.
No, it's pointless, isn't it?
You know what I mean? So I got kicked out of every band I was in, and then my last band, the grunge band, was the bass player decided to stage a coup, and she took over and started singing instead. And it was really brutal. It was really, really brutal. And we were kind of at that stage where, all the labels were looking to sign us up and all that kind of stuff. But she did me a favour, because I wouldn't have went full-time writing. I would have just kept.
I was going to say that, for being in bands for you, it's like you can't, even that point where you get the deal, it just carries on the same as it was before.
And it's hard. It's a hard wee, it's like Mercury Rev said, it's like being in a family or like a marriage that somebody you didn't even want to date. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's a weird setup. Brilliant, loads of brilliant things in it, but it wasn't meant to be. It wasn't meant to be. It's so sad.